What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another special edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. In this episode, we bring you an interview with Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. She is co-editor of the book Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing, and she is a professor at Wayne State University in Detroit. This week, we are going to hold off on bringing you the news because we're focusing on preparing to go to Racine, Wisconsin to extend solidarity to striking UAW Local 180 members there. For those of you who don't know, these brothers and sisters have been on strike for 7 months, and We Rise Fighting has helped organize a Solidarity Day on December 17th in Racine. Brian has also covered this strike in previous episodes. So please check out our Facebook page for the flyer and details of this event, and feel free to share. As always, I am Rick Urrutia with my co-hosts Brian Pfeiffer and Jerry Scapatulo. Brian is going to lead us into the interview after we listen to this beat I recorded on cassette. It's called Nightmare Before Cassette. Okay, we're here today with Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, a professor at Wayne State University and author of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing. We're honored to have you today here, Doctor. And we usually ask our guests just to start by introducing yourself, a little bit about your background and what you're doing today. And we're really happy to have you on the show, so welcome.
Sure, thanks so much. So just tiny correction, so I'm the co-editor of Organize, Fight, Win, Black Communist Women's Political Writing, which is the first sort of collection of Black communist and communist adjacent women's primary documents. So it's a collection of some, it's a range of things, committee reports, articles in newspapers like Freedom newspaper, some memoirs, some pieces in political affairs, theoretical journals. So there's a whole sort of span of different types of writing in that text. But anyway, I am, as you said, an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. My research sits at the intersection of critical Black studies, political theory, political economy, and intellectual history. And one of the main sort of foci of my work is the intersections of anti-Black racial oppression and anti-communism, but as a synecdoche for sort of manifold forms of anti-radicalism, from sort of internationalism to labor militancy to even anarchism, and all manifold forms of sort of anti-radical repression. And then another aspect of my scholarship is looking at thinkers in what I call the tradition of radical Blackness, which is a sort of riff off of Cedric Robinson's Black radical tradition, but actually looking at persons who understand sort of racialization to emanate from the capitalist mode of production, with political economy as one of their main sort of analytical frameworks. And I just completed a book manuscript called Black Scare, Red Scare, which is looking at the intersections of the Black Scare and the Red Scare, or anti-Black racial oppression and anti-radicalism, between 1919 and 1957. So a similar time span to Organize, Fight, Win, and just looking at the ways that all three branches of the federal government, as well as state government, sort of imbricated a fear about Black liberation with like hostility toward economic democracy broadly conceived, and created discourses, modes of governance, and internal logic out of the imbrications of those fears. So that is what I do.
You have
a variety of primary documents in the book, which are quite something. And just want, if you would speak to the role of Black women communists as both theoreticians and as organizers, which one of the focuses of Re-Rise Fighting is to resurrect this history in terms of labor history, but it's also very broad. So, and of course, Black women in labor history, oftentimes in this country, are not written about, or I should say that I think what you say in your book is that's part of the anti-communism that we face, but also racism in scholarship and institutions and related items. But generally, if you could speak to some of the work that you found as Black women theoreticians and organizers in the time periods that you found the documents, that'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that one of the unique things about looking at Black communist women's writing is sort of thinking about what counts as sites of knowledge production and what counts as knowledge, right? So I would argue that these sort of committee reports that are being done, where, for example, somebody like Liliana Burrows is critiquing like the failures of Negro work, that is a site of sort of theory, right? She's theorizing about not only, she's actually making a concrete assessment about what's not happening, but also theorizing about what needs to happen and what the outcomes of that work will be. But also, so for example, we include some columns from Freedom newspaper by Alice Childress, her Mildred columns, which are fictional columns, but they're predicated on a fictional domestic worker and her engagement with all sorts of ideologies and happenings around her. And so again, and so that, you know, that pushes us to look at like fiction as a site of both knowledge production and theorizing. And I would say that so much of Black women's theorizing comes out of their organizing work, whether they're organizing around the Scottsboro Boys or pushing for a union for domestic workers, or, you know, creating organizations like the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, or you know, organizing around Black women being pushed out of the industrial sector during post-World War II demobilization. And so much of their work, so much of their thinking comes out of the practical work, at the same time that we don't want to slip into the sort of fallacy that Lewis Gordon talks about, where we only reduce Black people to experience and leave the theory to white folks, right? That we actually need to look at how it is that they're under. Theory is like, how do we understand the what, and then how do we offer up a so what? And that's precisely what these women are doing in this sort of panoply of writing that we collect. And so I really think that the other thing too, right, is one of the reasons why Black people generally and Black women particularly are left out of any studies of like the Communist Party, for example, is because of this idea, this sort of anti-communist idea that, you know, these people are dupes of Moscow. They're these robotic, like, people who just tout the party line. But if you actually like drill down and look at what they're writing and what they're doing, they quote Lenin and Stalin and, you know, Marx sometimes, but they're really just like, this is a class analysis of what organizing ought to look like in the South, right? This is a class analysis of why it is that we cannot have a proletarian revolution if we do not pay attention to domestic workers, right? And practical things like, you know, if you want to bring more Black women into the Communist Party, white comrades need to dance with them. Because we're trying to sort of build the world that we want to see, we have to model those social relations as well. So I would say that those are some of the sides of sort of theory and practice within the text.
Dr. Burden-Stelly, it sounds like part of your work is to debunk this notion of the Communist Party as a sort of just a very narrow-minded, ideologically motivated organization that used Black women and other women of color and other people of color. But could you talk about the extent to which unions like the Yukapawa, the cannery workers, and the food and tobacco workers actually took in hand as a goal and a role of the union to get out of the way slash open the doors and elevate women of color into leadership in the labor unions of the 40s, and especially how that actually spelt success for those unions?
Sure. Like, I think it's interesting. I feel like I heard Gerald Horne say one time that the communists were really the first sort of proponents of affirmative action and actually put it into practice, right? Because some people might, and then that's where you might get this conception that they're just using Black people or tokenizing them. But what they're actually doing is showing a model of what is to be done. And so even if they are sort of deliberately picking particular Black women or Black people to be ahead of a union, well, that is what you do to challenge these seniority things, right? That's what you do to challenge all white shops. You have to actually model that work. And it's not tokenism, right? It's like, we need to actually see that this is possible, right? That people need to have a model for the type of work that we are pushing for in theory. And so I think it's really, and the other thing too is that Black women make up a majority to a plurality of these industries. So why wouldn't they be in leadership, right? Why wouldn't they have a hand in organizing other people who look like them in the shop, not through some sort of identity reductionism, but rather to bring these people along, right? To show that, there's also this misconception that like Black women are averse to unions or that they're unorganizable. And so putting Black women in these positions of leadership or these positions of power allows for a challenge to that narrative on the one hand, but also for Black women to do that practical work of organizing other Black women, other minoritized folks, so that there's a more robust and I think representative union.
Thank you.
Hey, Dr. Burden-Stelly. I did manage to get into a little bit of your book, Organized Fight Win. I haven't gotten to section 3 yet, though, which I'm really excited about, really interested in, the section on fighting fascism. For the benefit of our listeners, could you offer some takeaways from that section? Any particular highlights?
Yeah, I think that, so there's this quote that I say probably every time we do any talk about our book, which is, there's this idea that fascism is the term that like Euro-Americans use when they start getting treated like the colonized. And that's to summarize Aimé Césaire. And what that says is that fascism becomes a way to focus on white workers, right? And the way that white workers are being sort of dispossessed or dominated in ways that racialized and colonized folks are treated all the time. And I mention that because the way that people like Claudia Jones and Thelma Dale and Eslanda Good-Robeson think about fascism is that, yes, they're interrogating European fascism, but they're also looking at the United States and the way that the United States has its own fascistic character because of Jim Crow in particular. And that they say that if you look at the condition of women, generally, and Black women particularly, you can see the way that fascism is operating in the United States. And so they talk about, for example, the triple K, the kitchen, kids, and church theory or like ideology that permeated Nazism. And that same ideology was being used after World War II to rationalize why women were being pushed out of industry and to sort of rationalize Black women being pushed back into domestic work, which they had sort of only narrowly escaped during the war. And part of what somebody like Claudia Jones is saying is that even progressive men are not seeing that this ideological attack is actually also an attack on labor. And that if you believe in this sort of gendered discourse, if you take that seriously, then you're reinscribing like women's subordination. And so I think that part of what's interesting about the way that they look at fascism is that they're critiquing imperialism, they're critiquing colonialism, they're critiquing male chauvinism. All of those things are foundational to how they see fascism playing out, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. And also, like, peace is central to everything. Peace is central to how they understand how fascism can actually be overcome, not just through this mythology that the United States saved the world from fascism during World War II, but actually existing fascistic practices that reify big business, that again, subject women, that subject Black people to, and colonized people to racialized violence up to and including lynching, and war, right? And the warmongering and militarism, that those are the things that we need to combat if we're actually gonna combat fascism. And I think that that analysis is extraordinarily prescient if we look today at the attack on LGBTQ and trans folks, the attack on so-called wokeism, which is an attack on Black people and minoritized people. You know, if we look at the attack on abortion, all of those, we look at the rampant militarism, right? The drive toward World War III, which is also something that they pointed out in the 1950s, is drive toward World War III. So all of those things, all of their analysis of fascism, I think, are exceedingly relevant to how we ought to understand fascism today.
So I have a question regarding in the recent period, probably in the past few years, 10 years or so, but there's been a variety of work that has been produced, such as yours, and also Dr. Ransby wrote a book on Mrs. Islanda Robinson and Miss Ella Baker, and a recent book on Mrs. Rosa Parks, and her Mrs. Parks' life in Detroit has virtually been either sanitized or virtually liquidated. And she spent the majority of her adult life there, of course, and was doing all kinds of activities, such as Puerto Rican freedom struggles, among many, many other things. So my general question is, in line with your work, which seems to be very similar, the role of Black women, not just fighting for labor issues, but also as internationalists, and many other ways and contributions that have been made over the decades. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so what's important about my work is that these women are anti-imperialist constitutively. Anti-imperialism is the crux of their work, right? They're anti-imperialist and they're socialist. Even the ones who are not in the CPUSA, but we call them Communist Party adjacent, they're still socialist in their sort of orientation. And both of those things, socialism and anti-imperialism, require an internationalist analysis. Why? Because capitalism is internationalist, because imperialism is an internationalist project. And so if it is that the ruling class is internationalist, we have to be also. And they fundamentally understood this. They understood the ways that warmongering abroad redounds back to the United States. They understood the ways that how colonized women in Africa, for example, are treated is very consonant to the way that Black women are treated in the United States. So Williana Burroughs was writing about this in the 1930s, and they understand that like these borders are sort of artificially bound territories that actually have deep connections if we look at forms of exploitation and oppression that are actually operating globally. And so, but the other thing that they do that's really, I think, important is that they take the very localized, very sort of concrete issues and make those internationalist connections. And so like the local is actually the basis for their internationalism. It's the basis for how they understand what's actually happening in the world. It's not some sort of abstraction like it is that, you know, when we're looking at the Scottsboro case, for example, the way that if it is that we believe our own analysis and the courts are capitalist courts, if the courts are the sort of the jurisprudence of the ruling class, and the way that we get these boys off is through a mass movement, not only in the United States, but internationally. And we connect the Scottsboro boys to the invasion of Abyssinia. We connect it to the Spanish Civil War and see these all as forms of like legal lynchings are forms of class rule. They're fascistic in character, like what's happening in Ethiopia, like what's happening in Spain, and it does a sort of political education work to sort of broaden folks' analysis. But then there also are material and concrete connections. So, for example, Ford Motor Company is implicated in all of that, on all of those three things, right? For the way that they're supplying money and the way that they're sort of implementing a imperial-like relationship between the U.S. North and the U.S. South, the way that they're sort of exporting weapons. So anyway, so I think that the internationalist analysis really comes from their local conditions, but also from the fact that they realize war, imperialism, colonialism, and militarism, they're all, capitalism are all internationalists, and so their analysis needs to be as well.
You know, here on this podcast, we also report the news, and, you know, we try to keep people up to date as to what's happening in places like Amazon, the railway struggle, Starbucks, the United Auto Workers, UPS negotiations are coming up next year. So, you know, there's some struggles that are happening that we like to report on. my question is too, any other groups that you would like to add to that struggle that should be recognized, within labor? And the second part of that question is, any advice for some of these workers and their struggle?
Well, I mean, what I'm really paying attention now is like the UC strikes. I went to the University of California, Berkeley for my PhD. There was a big COLA strike that was happening actually in 2020, but the pandemic kind of shut it down. And so it's really interesting to see it back in full effect. And also the kind of retaliation that's happening against professors who are wanting to engage or engaging in work stoppages in solidarity with the striking postdocs and graduate students. And it's interesting that, and we see a similar thing, right? That the union leaders of so they're UAW, I guess, right? That's their union, that they're actually entering into these sort of kind of capitulating negotiations that the majority of like the rank and file of the union don't necessarily agree with, right? And I think that is sort of parallel to the strike breaking that Congress has engaged in with the rail workers. So there's a way that union work is really difficult, especially because our conditions are so dire, right? That so many people so many workers are suffering, that there is this there's both coercion, but then there's like co-optation that encourages a particular type of capitulation. And so I think that part of what thinking alongside Organized Fight Win and also what's going on now is how do we keep ordinary workers at the center of our analysis? Because the other thing that I'm seeing is that there's a sort of celebritization of some of this organizing work. So even with some of the Amazon labor union stuff, like these people are going to I don't know if I can, anyway, people are going to the Grammys. They're going to they're firmly ensconced in Hollywood. And like that celebritization of that was just not the work that was not, it was a sort of opposite. So somebody like Paul Robeson, who's probably the first superstar in the world, he goes from being a superstar to an organizer, not an organizer to a superstar. And so I think that all of these things, so I don't have really a concrete answer. I'm just thinking about all of these things together and how, co-optation and coercion are working like overtime to really break labor power. But we keep going, right? We keep on seeing these labor strikes and unions forming. And so I'm just interested to see how sort of sustainable it is, especially with the sort of the Fed-induced recession, which is an attack on labor, with this kind of unprecedented move that Congress just made to break a strike. I'm just interested to see like how the will of workers will hold up. And frankly, if the rail workers strike anyway, which I think they should, like shut it down. Shut it down, which means that so many other workers have to be in solidarity to sustain that, because we saw what happened with Patco in the 1980s, right? So that is always the danger, but there's more at stake, I would say, with the rail workers than with Patco. Like the, air traffic controllers are important, but this is literally the crux of our economy. And so if the rail worker, if they hold it down, I really think that will be to the benefit of the working class in general.
Yes. Dr. Burden-Stelly, what might be your recommendations for providing a sufficient amount of basic labor education to workers, generally speaking? As doubtless you would agree, we've all had our labor history stolen from us, our women's history, our Black history. And to what degree would you say that bringing that education to workers is a primary and or necessary task for us on the left? And how might we do that?
It's a good question. I think it's actually really important, because even with some of these, there's some things, for example, that certain labor organizers have said about kind of, they're asserting themselves as kind of bucking labor history or bucking sort of traditional union tactics, right? That they're kind of doing their own thing. And it's kind of like, okay, but we actually do need to, we have to study the history, number one, because it's like, as I say, like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And secondly, because there's like nothing new under the sun. Like there's nothing new. Now it's obviously articulated to our historical and material conditions, but it's not necessarily new. We don't need to reinvent the wheel all the time. We can look and see how people like Walter Reuther and other backward labor folks, helps to crush unions, right? We can see how something like the Taft-Hartley helped to crush unions. We can see how anti-communism helped to crush unions in the long term, right? So we can learn those, we can study that, and we don't need to relearn those lessons per se, right? I think we saw the real detriment of the racism and white supremacy in unions. We don't need to relearn that lesson. And so I think, a way to go about it is just, when we're doing things like mutual aid or satisfying the material conditions of strikers or of workers, like we can include political education. So, we bring the backpack full of supplies or whatever, the basket full of clothing or whatever, the winter jackets. And then we talk about, okay, why is it that mutual aid is needed to supplement what the state should be doing, right? And how are these mutual aid programs, for example, akin to what the Black Panthers were doing, right? And how are the Black Panthers in conversation with like the League of Revolutionary Workers? What were they doing? And so I think that there's just a sort of practical way that doesn't feel so ideological and heavy-handed to let people know that like there's a long history of labor organizing. I think that what can happen is that people become too pedantic and too dogmatic. Like it's about getting Marx or Trotsky or Proudhon, whoever, just right. And nobody cares about that. Like it's fascism outside. Nobody cares about what Marx said on page 132 of the Grundrisse. Like we don't care. What we care about is what are the practical applications of those things, and what do those theoretical sort of differences, how do they influence organizing, or what the sort of practical concerns actually are?
Thank you.
To your point, we're having there's a strike going on right now for 7 months, UAW local 180 and 807. And to your point, we're actually we started with a Solidarity Day, and then we extended it to a strike solidarity school, and we're going to kick off Wednesday before December 17th with a movie night, and then a couple days of what you just described, like right there at the Union Hall, like in the parking lot and in the Union Hall. And a lot of that comes from some of the work that you've done and things that we've learned about that were done already in the 1930s. And I'm saying that just to say, is to preface my question, that Mr. Paul Robeson, the role of Black workers in the UAW and other locals, especially CIO-led unions. And generally the question is how would this local in particular, UAW 180, was formed in 1936. It's a foundational union. The UAW 72 right down the road was founded in the 30s too. And these two unions alone were absolutely essential to the civil and human rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And like if you ask most people there, they have absolutely no clue about this at all. So some do, and some are labor historians, but and fundamentally, Black workers were absolutely essential to that, as Dr. Joe Trotter wrote about in Milwaukee. So just generally a question about the role of Black workers and the importance of that, and trying to bring this labor history to the workers on the line, and like some of the forms and methods that you might suggest, or maybe that could be done in the future, instead of, as you said, just being kind of esoteric, but actually bringing this right to the workers, and maybe these other forms and methods that you might have done yourself, or maybe suggest in the future.
Well, I'm a huge fan of the pamphlet. Like I probably have hundreds of those like communist pamphlets that they're just so practical. Like they're little tiny things, and they serve several functions. One is a fundraising function. So they would sell them for like 3 cents or 2 cents or 5 cents or whatever. So there's that, right? But then it's also, but it also would synthesize things. So they might have a pamphlet that's like Claudia Jones' statement before the court in 1951. They might have an excerpt from We Charge Genocide. They might have a speech that somebody gave. And so they're just so practical, and they help to distill really complex theory into sort of digestible and easily readable, easily circulatable content, right? And they're cheap to produce. And that also encourages like collective study, because the other thing about political education, it's not to, we can't all be marks in our cloak in the library in the basement studying until we get boils. Like, that's not political education. Political education, it has to be collective. Like, we have to struggle over the concepts, we have to struggle over the theories, and actually make sure that we all have a common language, a common understanding of like, what do we mean when we say imperialism? When we say the bosses, like, what do we mean? Do we still need to interrogate the labor aristocracy? I think we do, right? Like, and what are the debates around that? And so I think that that pamphlet model is just a really good model, like, dusting off the sort of 12 volumes of Lenin. I just don't know how practical that is. And we just have so much work at this point, and it's so much accessible online. And so we can excerpt like Black Reconstruction, we can have an end to the neglect of the problem of the Negro woman. And that's sort of like, honestly, Organize, Fight, Win, like, it's a good teaching text, but we also had organizers and activists in mind as we put this together, because so many of those pieces are really short, they're really dense, but not overly complicated in the way that people write today. And so, I think that that's a really good model. And then, like, in terms of, I can't remember exactly what what the first part of your question was. Just about, what was the first part of the question? Sorry, I lost it.
I believe like how we take this history, some of which you've already written about, right to the workers, because there's so many barriers for workers economically and otherwise to like go to a university or even go to a community college, like in practical methods and how we're actually bringing this material to the workers in a real way for them to win and advance. Especially the role of Black women workers, for example, are so critical, and so many times that history is only in certain spaces.
It's just, this is not an easy question for me to answer, just because, like, I forget that, like, my knowledge is not the knowledge that everybody has, right? So, like, I came to like communism and socialism through Black people. And so when, and I've got a PhD in Black studies. And so when people say like, Black people, that stuff isn't accessible, I'm like, really? And so, like, I just feel like we have Al Gore's internet now. Like, it's, and I think that audiobooks are super important too. I think audiobooks are actually really good tools, as well as podcasts, because everybody's not always going to read. Now, granted, I'm a proponent of reading. I'm a literist, I guess, but like, I think people should read. But then you have these other supplementary things for people who might, like, if you take the bus to work, you can either read a pamphlet or you can listen to something on Audible, right? You can listen to a podcast. And so, but I think that what we have to do is re-emphasize that study is essential to struggle, because, mobilization without a theoretical grounding is just movement, right? Galvanizing and organizing are not the same thing. And essential to organizing, I think, is ideology. It's political education. And so I think, again, doing it in a way that you just relate it to things very practical. So, when we're talking about workers, we have to talk about like the gig economy. We have to talk about what categories are extant now. We have to talk about, when we talk about, for example, do you remember before the crushing of this labor strike happened by Congress, basically first of all, Obama passed an executive order giving sick days to federal workers, except railway workers. But also, do we not remember when the NBA was going to go on strike and stupid LeBron called Obama? And Obama told them not to strike. And so we can sort of, people know what the NBA is. Like, we can make these things very practical, very sort of day to day. And I think that that's how we begin to talk about political education. And then we can, sneak Lenin and Marx and what have you in the back end. But like, we have to start with like very practical, real examples, and things that are relevant to the workplace.
Dr. Burden-Stelly, I want to ask you a question that I hope you'll forgive me for asking it seemingly coming out of nowhere, but I wondered in your excavations and your studies, you may have come across the life of Miranda Smith, who was an African American woman communist and member of the Food and Tobacco Workers in the 40s. And if you could say anything about her life that you may have had the opportunity to discover.
You know, I had not heard of her until you sent me those questions, except that I had heard of her because I said, this name sounds really familiar. So number one, she's mentioned in An End to the Neglect of the Problem of the Negro Woman by Claudia Jones. So she's mentioned in that, and that is where I saw her name. But she's also, there's this pamphlet that I use in a lot of my writings it's from the Committee to Defend Negro, the National Committee to Defend Negro Leadership. And there's a pamphlet called An Appeal in Defense of Negro Leadership. And she's in there. So there's like a paragraph about her because I guess she was like targeted by the KKK like a month or 3 days before she had a heart attack.
Yes.
And then she's mentioned in Herbert Aptheker's The Negro Woman, which was a paper or like an article he wrote in maybe 1951 or something like this. And so she was there. And then interestingly, there was like the Miranda Smith division of like the Los Angeles County Communist Party. You know, there's these different Miranda Smith sections. And so she died when she was 34, apparently. And so I don't know much about her, but what's interesting, if I had known more about her, she probably would be in this volume. Although we've left out we left out Shirley Graham Du Bois, we left out like Queen Mother Moore, etc. But Miranda, she fits squarely into like our time frame. But I just don't know how much she wrote though. That's the other thing, because you know, she was rank and file, like a rank and file organizer, and I don't know how much she wrote, but yeah, so I only know enough to be ignorant at this point, but like she's all up and around the things that I study. Yeah.
Well, doctor, for somebody who says she doesn't know much about her, you know a lot. You know more than most people. And I'll just say that no, I don't think she wrote very much, but she was the highest elected African American woman in all of labor, period, by 1949. And there is a transcription of a speech, however, that she gave to the CIO in 1949 in Boston, in which she, was basically chastising and or begging the CIO to come out against the anti-lynching bill at the time. And I think more will be written about her as time goes by. But thank you for that, for that information. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Burden-Stelly, want to be respectful of your time. If we could do one more question?
Sure.
Okay, so then I'm going to take that question. So my question is, any advice, words of wisdom for today's anti-war movement and new activists in the labor movement?
Join an organization. You have to join an organization. You have to contribute to that organization and do work in that organization, wage struggle in that organization. I think that there's so much sectarianism now, and there's just so much of the sort of toxic individualism that has creeped into our organizations, where anytime there's any trouble or contradiction, people want to collapse the organization rather than wage principled struggle. And you cannot build any mass movement or mass base if you are not in organizations. And I know that, there's a lot in the online left is against organizations and about horizontalism and all this other stuff. Okay, you have to be in some sort of entity that allows for the building of a mass base. A whole bunch of individuals cannot wage a movement. That's just I guess insurgency or unorganized insurgency. I don't know, but which maybe has its place, I guess, wildness, but like we have to do more than that. And so for the anti-war movement, I don't think that USians need to spearhead that. The problem is that we are the most highly propagandized nation in the world, and some of the analysis is off, right? We don't necessarily do a good job of understanding primary and secondary contradictions and what the content of imperialism actually is. And so people talk about all of these different types of so-called imperialisms that actually I think are not very astute, and that could be just pages out of like the State Department handbook. And so I think that an anti-war movement has to be internationalist. We have to take the lead of people who bear the brunt of U.S. warmongering, which is not, we bear the brunt of it in terms of our taxpayer dollars. And this is why we have we have no social safety net, because all of our money is going to like warmongering. But I really think that we need to take the lead from the global South. I think we have to be in solidarity with from Palestine to, Mali, to Syria and beyond. And I think, the Western chauvinism in so many of our movements, we really, really have to interrogate that. We have to interrogate that, and this U.S. exceptionalism that can permeate our movements. And so, and I'm in an organization called Black Alliance for Peace. We're an anti-war movement. We understand peace not as the absence of conflict, but as a condition by which all of these contradictions will be resolved. And so I think peace is foundational to everything. I just truly believe that, because peace is the condition by which we have ecologically sound, people-centered, human rights-driven formations and realities that are to the benefit of the majority. If war is at the center, none of that is possible, right? And so, and war, war includes sanctions. Those forms of war, low-intensity warfare, like sanctions, like embargoes, all of those. None of and any looks askance anytime you hear the United States talking about democracy, human rights, women's rights, good governance, because we have look around and read the room here and see what's happening here before you go and think the United States is waging war anywhere on behalf of any of that. So that's my advice.
Right on, Dr. Burden-Stelly. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure and very insightful. Yeah. I'm very excited to share this with our listeners. Thank you all for listening, and we will be back next week with We Rise Fighting. We're going to leave you off with some music. Thank you, everyone, and solidarity and love to all.